Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Pickle Juice and Sports Drinks, Myth versus Fact for Athletic Training. My name is Molly Cole and I'm the Senior Associate Director of Alumni Engagement in your Office of Alumni Relations here at Northeastern. I want to quickly thank you all for joining us today. We have a wide spectrum of attendees ranging from alumni to parents and also some students who are logged in all across the country. Shortly, you will be hearing from Mike McKenney, who will be leading today's program, but before he begins, I want to be sure that everyone is comfortable with their volume levels and also with the Blackboard Collaborate chat feature. Also remember, this will be archived and available on our website. If you do run into any serious issues and you have to log off, you'll still be able to get this information when it's done. In case you haven't found your chat box yet, it's located at the bottom left of your computer screen. Be sure that it's working, and I would love for you all to please type in your name as well as the city or state where you are watching. Before I officially turn things over to Mike, I want to let you know that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in the chat box. I'll work to organize them, and then we're going to answer them intermittently throughout the presentation. And then if you do have any questions, we'll take them at the end as well. So I want to turn things over to Mike, and I'll be communicating with you guys through the chat box if you run into any serious issues. Video. Cool. There you go.
All right, there we go. All right, hello everybody. As you heard, my name is Mike McKenney. I'm an athletic trainer here at Northeastern University. Primarily, I work with men's ice hockey, but in sports performance, we pretty much treat all our athletes that are here. Prior to my coming to Northeastern, I have a background in electrolyte and fluid replacement research, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Part of what this presentation revolves around is there's a lot of myths perpetuated by marketing and media and sports marketing in general, and how that interacts with more facts and what we know from science, and kind of how those two interplay with each other. So what we're going to do is basically go through kind of an evidence-based approach to how this research kind of lines up with what sports drinks companies are telling us and maybe what they're not telling us. Part of this is I just wanted to start out is I'm not really kind of going after one specific company one way or the other. Really, it's just kind of about, this is just commentary again on how our body reacts to exercise and how, is that okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. How our body reacts to exercise and how these products that we take, how they affect our body as well. There's a lot of assumption surrounded by this, and just kind of the scientific definition of the word assumption is something we believe to be true, but we can't necessarily prove. And I think that's what a lot of this relies on us doing, is assuming instead of actually looking into information. For those that are actually maybe working with athletes or people of a high level of physical activity, or maybe yourselves training for the Boston Marathon every year, this can also be useful on a personal level. So working with this, we want to say that you've probably seen a lot of these advertisements for numerous products that claim to rehydrate and replace electrolytes. Fluid replacement and electrolyte replacement typically go together because salt and fluid replacement, they rely on each other in order for humans to be, I guess, in a state of fluid balance or hydrated. This isn't to say that some of these claims are untrue. I just think that science can actually kind of guide a little bit easier an approach that can be more effective for maybe you, the people you treat, and whatnot. Unfortunately, finely tuned might mean something along the lines of a company telling you to actually drink less of their product, which obviously doesn't make very good business and marketing sense. So sometimes it's not necessarily being untruthful, but maybe withholding some of that information to again further a marketing agenda. Moving from here on out, we're probably going to mostly stick with Powerade, not because I dislike Powerade specifically. I think it's just useful to keep a consistent example, so we're not jumping around to different products, and this way we can keep all labels and everything kind of the same. As you can see from these advertisements, you can see a lot of it revolves around not necessarily facts and numbers, but just saying, you know, we're going to replace electrolytes and fluid. Now, Powerade has actually got the most truthful ad here because your sweat obviously isn't orange like the Gatorade one in the lower right-hand corner. but it actually lists the 4 main ingredients in sweat. And we're going to talk about that a little bit too, because with sweat losses is also where we talk about sodium losses. There we go. So to frame this discussion, we always need to talk about human averages. Now, it's very important to remember that these are averages. A lot of people can be above and below this, but again, for the purpose of this talk, we just kind of need to look at the average side of things. Primarily, sodium is the greatest electrolyte that you can find in your sweat, and the reason we talk about sweat, as I just talked about, this is the #1 way you're going to lose fluid replacement. You're going to lose sodium and require fluid replacement, and sodium replacement is going to be because of your sweat losses. For those that remember back to their chemistry courses, amounts and concentrations, especially in the human body, are represented by millimoles per liter. But for those that aren't really familiar with that, I've done the conversions for you in the parentheses to the right for grams, so when we look at some labels and things like that, you can see or get a better idea of what you're looking at. So moving on from sodium, potassium is the 2nd greatest electrolyte lost in sweat, and by 2nd greatest, it's 2nd by a wide margin. So that's why a lot of this discussion usually is framed around sodium and how that works. Calcium and magnesium are also lost, but you can see those are what we consider trace ingredients because they're going to be in much lower amounts. Sodium is important for hydration because water follows salt. Everywhere salt goes in your body, water follows it. It's important for the health inside your cells to make sure that balance is stable. When you start exercising and fluctuating that one way or the other, your sodium levels are going to fluctuate, as well as with sweat losses. So with this in mind, we're going to go to an example using Powerade as our quote sports drink. The following slides are an example that was presented to me from a mentor of mine when I was in grad school, and I've still yet to find another way of representing this that makes more sense to a broader population of people. So I want to thank him for showing me kind of how to make more sense of this to other people. And basically we start by doing the composition of Powerade. Now this is just based off of a bottle that I went and grabbed out of a vending machine down the hall from my office. And basically what it tells us is there's 250 milligrams of sodium, 60 milligrams of potassium. What you need to understand is when this translates to millimoles per liter, that doesn't look like a very large number. Because if we go back and remember human averages are 55 millimoles per liter, so if I'm losing 55 millimoles to start, and one bottle that you might drink after a workout only has 10 millimoles, you might see where this is going. I choose this because it's the most common size available. It's sold in bulk at Sam's, Costco, BJ's, any major wholesaler. But it's not just Powerade. If you look over to your lower right, you can see a label I took a picture of the other day, your standard Gatorade bottle. And while it has a little bit more sodium and potassium, it's not significantly different from each other. One of the things I think that sports drink companies need to be better about communicating is why they formulate their drinks the way they do. It's not necessarily to replace electrolytes, it's to replace fluids. Our body uses those compositions to basically get fluid in your body a little bit quicker, but not necessarily replacing electrolytes that you've lost. And so we'll go on from there to a sweat loss example. Again, when we're doing this, we talk about averages because I think that's the easiest way to approach this. So an average size athlete's about 165 pounds, and let's pretend they complete an hour and a half of exercise, which with sports training of continuous exertion is pretty typical. Human average sweat rates are about 2 liters per hour, and going back to our previous examples of sweat sodium concentration and potassium, 55 and 5 millimoles per liter respectively. Now, assuming scenarios are different, they don't drink anything. Unfortunately, this is shockingly common, so we never ever recommend this. And they do not urinate during exercise, which is fairly typical, so they're not undergoing fluid loss. And they drink the Powerade from our example that we just went over. Sodium and potassium, again, just to remind you, are the primary hot button ingredients that I like to talk about, simply because those are the primary things you're losing during exercise, and there's so much that revolves around them, whether you're talking about muscle cramping, performance curves, and that sort of material. So this is why it's really important to look at this. So this athlete will lose about 3 liters of water based on, or body water based on that example. So that's about 4% of their body weight. It's actually going to take this person somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.5 liters of water to actually completely rehydrate, because most standard recommendations right now say that you should replace 150% of the fluids you lose during exercise, because it's going to take a while, and with urination and free water loss, that's where that extra 50% comes from. So that, as you can see, that's quite a bit. The sodium they lose is 165 millimoles per liter. Again, assuming averages are 55 millimoles liter of a human, that's 3.7 grams of sodium. As a reminder, the FDA only recommends that people under 51 years of age ingest somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.3 grams maximum. So immediately, our athlete, ignoring our physical fitness requirements, is losing more sodium than the FDA recommends that you intake every day. So when you're dealing with a highly athletic population, those demands are going to be weighed a little bit differently than your typical recommendations. And the other thing that I wanted everyone to notice here is you only lose 15 millimoles per liter of potassium, or basically half a gram. The need to replace potassium through sports drinks or other supplements is pretty much negligible. You can eat a potato, you can eat a banana, but you're good to go. That's all you need. You don't have to worry about that. And we'll get to that also in a little bit. So knowing these kind of standards of what this example loses, you want to go on to the next slide and see how this is actually represented and what they'd have to replace. So based off Powerade alone, the bottle I showed you guys earlier, it would take 15 bottles of that Powerade to replace your sodium. That's over 8 liters of fluid. That's way too much, okay? Again, there's only a very small amount of sodium per bottle, so to replace that effectively by drinking, nobody can effectively drink 8 liters of water and be healthy with it. Second, you only need 10 bottles of Powerade to replace your potassium, but then if you were just replacing potassium, you would be 5 bottles short for your sodium replacement. And this obviously creates a large problem, because no one can comfortably drink, with the way our stomach and GI tract works, 6+ liters of fluid in a sitting. Why is drinking this much a problem? It's extremely dangerous, and we never recommend you do this, because there's a lot of effects that drinking that much fluid can have on the body that have very, very negative health benefits, or no benefits, my apologies, no health benefits. The overall concentration of sports drinks, as I talked about earlier, is to match kind of the concentration of your blood so it gets into your system better for fluid replacement. But what that does is that creates 2 isotonic solutions that, once you add them together, will actually dilute the overall solution. And what this does is it actually lowers your plasma sodium concentration, which can cause hyponatremia, which ends up potentially resulting in death. And the reason we bring this up is this happened to last year to a high school football player in Georgia who actually drank, I don't have it written down in front of me, but I believe if you look it up, for last year he drank 4 gallons of fluids, a mix of sports drinks and water, and then ended up going into a coma and dying several days later. But one of the things that you can feel if you're over drinking and lowering that plasma sodium level is nausea, headaches, loss of energy, and fatigue and confusion. These are usually associated after a hard workout and things that people drink to try and get back from, to prevent from happening. And here, I'm telling you, if you drink as much Powerade as that label says you have to replace your sodium, you're actually not only going to cause these, you can potentially put yourself in kind of a life-threatening position. One of the other things that people recommend is, okay, so you're going to drink a lot of water, a lot of fluids to basically prevent or offset during exercise everything you drink. This is where you have to be extremely careful, because someone actually did this, and they did a study on it. And what they did with these women is they had them exercise and lose a certain percentage of their body weight, but they wanted them to drink 4,000 milliliters, which is 135 U.S. ounces of water, during exercise to offset what they were expected to lose during exercise. The problem is, with this study, the low sodium category actually has more sodium than our Powerade example. So what's going to happen is, as they drink this, their plasma sodium, you would expect it to drop, and that's exactly what happened. And you can see here the low category is where we're kind of focusing our attention, because that's where these sports drinks are. If you add just water only, those numbers are even lower. And even the high sodium group still is fairly low, but not necessarily hyponatremic. Now, normal sodium values are between 137 and 142 millimoles per liter. So if you use that as your standard, you can see that these people, they started where they should, where a normal human is, and following an exercise, regardless of what they drank, they still ended up lower than they should be. 92% of these subjects had lower plasma sodium at the end of exercise, and 69% developed hyponatremia. Again, this is people following directions of what conventionally is recommended of replacing 150% of what you lose during exercise. Drinking water only developed 92% of hyponatremia, and results of drinking to prevent fluid loss during exercise is just a pretty good example of how this is going. Has anybody had any questions so far? Good. Or bad. If you guys have questions, please chime in. I'm more than happy to answer them. So what about fluid replacement, water or sports drinks? This is always a big question. There's a number of studies that focus on this. This is a semester's worth of information that I just can't share in the time given, but I picked a study that I think is pretty easy to understand as far as the applicability in the general settings that a lot of us find ourselves in working out. And that's, all right, you exercise to a certain percentage of your body weight, and then you immediately start drinking as soon as you're done with your workout. One of the things that this study did is they altered the sodium content and to be basically levels of increasing concentrations to see if we give people more sodium, what's going to happen. Now remember, our bottle of Powerade is 10 millimoles per liter. So even their lowest sodium before it's just water is still higher than our Powerade example. And you can see, even after exercising and rehydrating completely, everybody by about that 2-hour mark, if you look straight up, are in negative fluid balance. So that black line that goes from 0, all the way across is what you would consider above that as hydrated. And you can see, regardless of what people drink, regardless of sodium content, they all retain hydration. And as their body left to its own devices, by that second hour following hydration, they were all in negative fluid balance and considered dehydrated again. This is important to note that even if I tripled the amount of sodium in a Powerade, I'm still falling short on what would help.
We do have one question from Pete in Wilton, Connecticut. Pete asked, yesterday the New York Times stated that 8 glasses of water isn't necessary. What would you advise to youth football players for consumption amounts prior to workout?
So it's good that you just asked that, because I'm going to go right here. This next study is actually very timely in explaining this question. So just to give you an idea, what this particular study was done looking at the difference of sweat rates, fluid replacement rates, drinking ad libitum. And what that means is just, I have my water here, it's just how long it takes me to drink this without anybody telling me how much to drink. That's what the study was looking at. So when talking about what that New York Times article stated, 8 glasses of water isn't necessary, I think is a little bit maybe too far, because everyone's got their own individual demands. So if you go back to our sweat example, 8 glasses of water will not rehydrate that person from a fluid standpoint, not even come close. So that person might have higher demands, or somebody that might be more sedentary and is not losing as much body water as we think, 8 glasses might be, a bit overkill. Really, that's how you want to monitor it. As far as the actual amounts, those are going to vary between every single player, because sweat rates are different, and all things considered, their activity level is going to be different. And the study gives a really good example of those differences. The other thing is, and we'll get to this in a little minute, but when you're recommending for youth football players, especially at the high school level, instead of recommending a specific amount of water that's basically not customized to them, is having people track their body weight. And so you should always have a before and after body weight of exercise. Losing weight's normal, we sweat, that's okay, but it's making sure you return to that body weight by the next day, by the next activity session. So if you're finishing up at 3 p.m. and afternoon practice, it's really hot, and the next day's session starts at 1 p.m., you want to return to your body weight by 1 p.m. the next day. A good indicator of that is what your weight is first thing in the morning. So if you're going to discuss that, especially with high school football players, I highly recommend consulting their athletic trainer at school, because especially this time of year, they're really skilled in handling and tracking that, and especially giving those recommendations. Kind of circling back to this particular study, I think it'll help further that question a little bit. So what happened is the Division II football players in this study had only access to water at certain times during practice, and they could drink whatever they wanted, but the breaks were pretty well organized by the coaching staff. The NFL players are, well, NFL players. Not only do they have more than just water, they had every possible sports drink you can imagine, and people pretty much almost forcing it on them and drinking what they possibly could. This study is really, really impressive, because if you look at the percentage of sweat losses replaced, they're pretty accurate. You can see the NFL by the afternoon was actually a little bit less than our Division II football players who drank water only, and by the end of the day, they were actually pretty much dead even. Another thing to notice about that graph is you can see those bars only go up to about 65%. So that's an important note of human physiology, that we're actually really bad at metering how hydrated we are based off thirst. And you can see these athletes only replace anywhere between 65 to 80% of the fluids they lost during practice simply by drinking on their own. But Division II and NFL football players are not the same athletes from a training level, from a demand level, but you can see from a human physiology level they are very close. And so that's an important distinction with this. As we go on to the next slide, and I think this is where we start leaving your typical science things, and we go towards a lot of stuff that's been popularized in the media lately, whether it's pickles, bananas. You can see the high school football player in the lower left chugging mustard. We'll actually get to that in a second. Chicken noodle soup, and any number of other products, how our body works. And it's really interesting kind of what data actually shows us. Do you want me to answer that question? And so I just saw a question pop up here, is do caffeinated beverages count towards food consumption needs? This is always a loaded question, because there's a lot of recovery drinks, especially in the endurance world, that have caffeine as a part of them for hand-eye acuity and the performance benefit attached to them. Unfortunately, caffeine is also a diuretic, and so I never recommend it for any fluid consumption needs, because the more caffeine you drink, whether it's coffee, Mountain Dew, pre-workout powders that have caffeine in them, Spark Energy or anything like that, you're going to induce your body into a state where it's going to want to void water, void urine, and get rid of it. And so it's actually going to actively fight you on your hydration status. So anything that you use for hydration or rehydration purposes, I always recommend has nothing to do with caffeine. So, and we can probably talk about that coming up in a few slides as well. So kind of getting back to this again, I think mostly it's pickle juice, bananas, and chicken noodle soup, because those have been popularized in the media lately, and I think there's actually honestly some merit to what they say, but I think it's misplaced a little bit as well. So here we go. So in my research, we kind of wanted to test this. So a lot of research involving pickle juice revolves around the assumption that if I give people pickle juice during exercise, this originated out of treating muscle cramps. One of the popular theories of muscle cramps is electrolyte and fluid depletion is what causes those. If we have time at the end, I can get into that on a more detailed level, but I think that might actually be an entire webinar in itself, but I hopefully can answer those questions if people have it. But plasma and electrolyte changes are something that have always been surrounded that, and there's again, those assumptions that pickle juice is why I give it to a cramping athlete. They stop cramping because I just gave them a ton of sodium, and that's why they were cramping in the first place. Unfortunately, some of the studies that have maybe been used to support that claim, that's not what those studies were about, and I wanted to test some of the limitations of that research, and that's no one actually gave it to anybody during exercise. So in this particular study, we gave people up to 2 boluses of pickle juice with exercise, and what that means is that I gave them a drink before and I gave them a drink halfway through their exercise period. On some cases, based on body weight, these people ingested up to 2 grams of sodium. Now what you can see in this chart is as exercise increases, sodium levels in the blood increase, which is a normal physiological change. We had a control condition, and you can see that that goes up and maintains the same rate as every condition. So nothing actually changed. Whether I gave them nothing, 1 bolus of pickle juice, or 2 grams of sodium in 2 boluses of pickle juice. And there's a lot of sodium in it, because you can see down in the lower right, the concentration is 530 millimoles per liter. Powerade is 10. So when I'm trying to stack the deck in my favor to increase sodium replacement, it turns out our body's actually pretty good at regulating our sodium levels, and it didn't do much of anything. But pickle juice isn't the only place that people do this. You see a lot common in sports like soccer, sports that have halves and times where they can actually rest, is ingesting bananas after exercise. Another study that really looked at this found out that nobody's actually tested what's going on here with bananas and bananas and exercise. So they did 60 minutes of blood data where people ingested 30 minutes of bananas, 30 minutes post-exercise, ingested bananas to see what happens with plasma potassium levels. So plasma potassium concentration in the upper right is what we get from blood data. Potassium content changes is an estimation based off numerous blood variables. We can't actually 100% say for certain what that content is unless you, if I have a deceased human and drain them of all their fluids and test it. So obviously that's why we do estimations with that. But the concentration, that's a blood sample, so we can get that pretty accurately. This isn't to say that potassium will somehow get in your body at some point. It's just this idea that by taking it during exercise and increasing these levels doesn't necessarily occur. I see here on the end talking about pickle juice works for leg cramps on long bike rides. Interesting you bring that up. This author, actually Kevin Miller, has a study where they did they induced electrolyte. They didn't induce electrolyte deficit, but they actually got people to electrically induce cramps using an electrical stimulation machine. And so once they were in basically tetanus and their muscle was cramping, they gave them pickle juice and found out with pickle juice that the cramp duration was somewhere in the neighborhood of an average of about 86 to 87 seconds versus up to 200 seconds not doing anything about it. And the interesting about that study is not necessarily that pickle juice worked for cramps as a whole, it's that there's no possible way what the person was drinking with pickle juice had any effect on your plasma variables whatsoever, because it simply doesn't leave your stomach that quickly. So there's another, so they hypothesized, and I don't think anybody's actually been able to prove it yet, that there's an effect of the acetic acid or white vinegar in pickle juice in general that has a neurologically mediated reflex that causes some change in muscle cramping. And I think they've observed it in rats, but I don't think there's anyone to actually say, hey, this is why it happens in humans. He's got some really interesting research to read, and that study definitely is one to take a look at. Additionally, we wanted to see what happens with plasma responses after pickle juice, mustard, deionized water in dehydrated humans. So this is getting people to 3% body mass loss and ingesting anywhere of 1.5 grams of sodium or mustard post-exercise, and up to 60 minutes post-exercise, nothing changed. And so here we are, again, these studies stack the deck of sodium ingestion. So you've got all these, excuse me, I just got to take a drink of water. So we have all these studies that we're trying to basically stack the deck, and all these products that you can buy at GNC, via the internet, you know, marathon expos, whatever, that say if you have this huge amount of sodium, it's going to fix you. But now we're starting to find research and see that it doesn't make that a whole lot of difference. And just kind of looking through some of the questions here, I think this is a good spot because this is usually where questions tend to pick up. I'll back up here. And this individual is a regular runner, leg cramps in the middle of the night. What is my body telling me? It's hard to say. Leg cramps in the middle of the night can be a lot of things, from neuromuscular fatigue and sympathetic tone throughout the body from a neurological standpoint, not necessarily electrolyte and fluid deficit, especially if, and this is assuming that following your running, you had dinner, you rehydrated, and you're doing all these things with your diet. If you're still cramping, it's hard to say why that is, to be honest with you. Cramping is kind of a multifaceted phenomenon that is often presented as there's a hard and fast reason it's happening, and to be honest with you, it's not that clear. And why muscle cramping happens can be, honestly, a pretty wide variety of things, because you can fatigue the muscle to a point where it cramps and you're in total fluid balance. And so, according to that dehydration hypothesis, where you're in electrolyte and fluid loss, if I'm hydrated, I shouldn't cramp. So why are people that are perfectly hydrated and sitting at their desk cramping? And that's where it tends to lean more towards that neurological component of muscle cramping. So it might just be sometimes a symptom of overtraining and just fatigue, and the body's not recovering as a whole. There's another question here about what is the best thing to drink or take after 2 hours of weight training. Usually I think this kind of revolves around the arguments of chocolate milk and post-weight recovery drinks. To be honest with you, it almost doesn't matter as long as you're making sure that as you track body weights, and we'll get to that in a second. One of the things that I do recommend is if you're doing heavy weight training and undergoing muscle damage, your body does release potassium into your bloodstream. Higher levels of potassium can be associated with cardiac abnormalities and respiratory fatigue, and sometimes products like that, chocolate milk, have almost obscenely high amounts of potassium in them. And so if your body's actively trying to get rid of it, you don't need to be bringing it in until your body kind of reaches a status of equilibrium. And I think there's more to that question that'll become apparent in the coming slides, and we can talk about that a little bit as well. Same question, is days for very long bike rides? I'm a cyclist too, so I can answer kind of in that regard. A lot of the research surrounding fluid and electrolyte replacement works with endurance athletes and distance athletes, Ironman, and cycling. And the reason is almost anything you take in your in a workout that's going to be shorter than 70 minutes almost doesn't matter. So people running marathon, ingesting things will eventually leave their stomach and get there, but they're also running for upwards of 2 hours and 10 minutes for your elite runners, but 3 to 4 hours plus for your your average marathon runner, especially the ones we tend to see here in Boston. One of the things that you'll see is, especially on long bike rides, is you want to maintain, and by very long bike rides, I mean, I guess it's hard to say a time, but say if you're exercising for over an hour, you almost want to have some of the chews that they sell in bike stores and things like that. Goop makes them, Cliff Bars, Chalk Blocks, whatever, is some type of food, is going to actually be better accepted by your body with fluid instead of independently. But again, that's very long bike rides. You're exercising for over 90 minutes. That's where you're going to start to see those benefits. Your average high school football player that during a game might only actually play 10 minutes total of actual physical exertion, they're not going to see those differences as much as, say, your endurance athletes will. So someone else had a question here that their 16-year-old started 2 days last week. He's had some dehydration Tuesday and on Monday. Got a call from their athletic trainer saying he was bad. Picked him up, got him to the doctor. Dehydration and rhabdomyolysis. All blood work and EKGs were back to normal. Modified 2 days. Limit this occurring again. So rhabdomyolysis is a multifaceted animal. Dehydration can be a component of that, but there's also genetic components to that as well. That might not be something, I mean, it's genetic, you can't alter it. Hydration status is always a problem with two-a-days in high school football. And so kind of what we talked about earlier with monitoring their weight pre and post practice and making sure they return to that weight the next day. But another component of rhabdomyolysis is exercise intensity and not quitting an activity when your body says it's had enough and trying to go beyond it, and that's when muscle breakdown begins to occur. Hydration has a big role to play with muscle health, collagen tissue ostensibility, and can contribute to that. But hydration alone is not the only thing you can do to prevent rhabdo. Unfortunately, it's just only it's only a portion of it, because then your body has to work overtime. Again, we talked about in heavy muscular damage, your body releasing potassium and then overstressing the kidneys. That happens in rhabdo with cell death in the muscle cells. So, and then looking at long bike rides and the century rides, it's exactly one of the things I was getting at with 100-mile centuries. Those are pretty long bike rides. So actually making sure that you have hydration and things to eat during that. Honestly, whatever you want, it doesn't matter. Usually some carbohydrate electrolyte beverages from the carb standpoint will benefit those 80 to 100-mile time points. But that's honestly a level of fitness that I'd say the vast majority of youth athletes and your average Joe don't ever approach. That's a pretty that's a pretty heavy workload. So moving on from that is why usually this is the point where I just go through about 20-25 minutes of telling people that all these things don't work. Why are they not working during exercise? Usually there's 4 primary reasons that result in why this is going on, and that's gastric emptying. How fast do things leave your stomach? That's the key to the castle. That's the gateway. If it doesn't leave your stomach, your body doesn't absorb it. Your stomach only really absorbs trace amounts of B12 vitamins, alcohol, and some very, very trace amounts of water. Your small intestine does most of the work. So these 4 things that I have on the slide are what all slow that down. All of these are also very common with exercise. So even if you drink these things, especially like pickle juice and mustard, these really high sodium products you can buy from GNC, they're going to raise osmolality, lower pHs, and then if you're exercising, obviously that's a vigorous exercise, which vigorous exercise, just as an aside, is defined by if you're following your heart rate somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of your heart rate max, according to the ACSM. So that's usually what that's referred to. And low stomach volumes. A lot of people, when they eat these things, that's all they're eating, and so it's not going to leave your stomach as fast as we would like it to. And this is like, does anything work? Maybe. And the reason I say maybe is because everyone's a little bit different. But there's been some increasing literature awareness with some popular media scenes in the NFL and college football in this last year that actually kind of get at the point that the vast majority of your electrolyte replacement will come from food, not fluids. And that in some cases you can actually do 2 things at once. And one of these is chicken noodle soup. This is something that I think, unfortunately, recently with the whole Deflategate problem with the New England Patriots, that actually that football game, and we'll get to that in a second, had some pictures of the Colts sideline where they were actually drinking chicken broth during the game. There's actually some method to that. It's not just, here's this high sodium thing, let's throw it at somebody and see what happens. So what these subjects did is they went through an exercise protocol, became dehydrated to a certain level, and then they drank an entire can of chicken noodle soup, including the broth, noodles, everything. So the can was empty, and then drank for 2 hours to see what happens. You can see the chart on the right, similar to the charts we had before. The top of the line is considered hydrated, and then everything below is what's called negative fluid balance, or how dehydrated or hypohydrated are you. Chicken broth and soup actually took people in 2 hours closer to being hydrated than anything else by a very considerable margin. So even if you add in the standard deviations and the error of this data set, it's a pretty significant difference. So the big battle is not what do I take during exercise, how do I recover? And this is something that's been starting to gain steam a little bit, that it's not the liquids, it's not an electrolyte drink, it's none of that, it's food, because that's the biggest combining factor here. Is when they had the food plus the liquids, they were able to retain it better. So what this is saying is, if you're not eating your electrolytes after exercise, you're not going to get them back through fluids alone. And this is where you can see in the upper right, I mean, full disclosure, I'm not a New England or a Colts fan, I'm a Broncos fan, so I don't bring this up just to poke fun at the Colts. But they had these big carafes on the side of the sidelines with chicken broth. Now, the only research that I've been able to find that has anything to do with chicken broth actually does not support the use during games. It's either preloading with sodium anywhere between 90 minutes to 4 hours before a game, or the post-exercise that we just talked about. So this is a practice that this is how new things come about. This is how research is guided, actually, is by, does this practice work? Why does it work? But we do know, based off gastric emptying physiology that I talked about earlier, that these high amounts of sodium, the likelihood that it's leaving somebody's stomach and being utilized in poor Andrew Luck's body there is probably actually pretty low. It's only really ideal if you sit completely still for 30 minutes and don't move. That's when gastric emptying is at its ideal setting, and every time you move, everything changes and fluctuates. Unfortunately, in the NFL, they're up and down, they're moving, they're running, they're doing all sorts of, everything that you can do to delay gastric emptying is occurring, and so that's what this is kind of getting at. So if you want to add things into your diet, some reasonably healthy sources of sodium are, as we talked about, chicken noodle soup, deli meat, soy sauce, types of cheeses, pretzels, salted nuts, pickles, store-bought pasta sauce, and potassium is honestly really easy to include in your diet. And this is, again, assuming people are healthy and don't have any health issues with either of these ingredients. Pretty low buy-in from the grocery store to get your potassium replacement. I didn't put it on here, but it's also very true. Bacon is very high in sodium, and I know how people get that salt craving after a heavy workout, so bacon can do that as well, but that's not very healthy for you for many other reasons, so that's why I usually leave that off the list. And salt's in a ton of food, and to be honest with you, it's estimated between 30 and 40% of your water actually comes from food as well, because you need food to cook and create all these foods that we eat every day. So that's why if you're not eating to replace your electrolytes, you're not going to gain full fluid or sodium balance either. Getting back to what some other people talked about with hydration tips earlier is, what it gets back to, it doesn't matter what you drink during sports or activity. I think the NFL and college study kind of demonstrated that, because you won't completely replace your electrolytes with sports drinks. Drinking the thirst during practice, you should not gain weight during training. So when we talked about over drinking to replace everything we lose and then what that does to plasma sodium, that can be really dangerous. You can lose up to 2% of your body weight before you actually have a performance deficit that you need to start worrying about. But realistically thinking, everybody on a field of play is going to be having that performance deficit, so the level playing field with that is actually pretty steady. And also prevents over drinking, which can be a serious health issue. And just remember that weight loss during exercise is normal, and you should see fluctuations in weight because you're losing fluid and gaining it back. It's these huge fluctuations that go up and down that don't return that you have to pay attention to. And as we demonstrated in the numerous studies, rehydration takes hours, not minutes. So even if you finish your workout, crush 16 ounces of Gatorade, and that's all you drink for the rest of the day, I can bet you with pretty good odds that you're not going to be hydrated by the next day. Basically, if you start in a hole, you stay in a hole, and that's what's going to happen if you don't get your weight back. Drinking small, equal amounts of fluid every 20-30 minutes is a more ideal way to get fluid into your system. If I have 500 milliliters or 32 ounces of water and I drink it, I'm going to have clear urine in 30 minutes, and that's not because I'm hydrated, it's because your body has to deal with this huge influx of water and actually releases hormones for fluid regulation to the point where you actually start trying to get rid of it because your body thinks there's too much, when in reality you don't have enough. So people sometimes use that window as, oh, I have clear urine an hour after working out, I'm hydrated, I'm good to go, when in reality, you still have to continue to drink and eat throughout the evening. And also do not drink large amounts of fluid as fast as possible for the exact reasons that I just talked about. And this also goes for if you take a huge amount of sodium right away and do nothing, your body's going to get rid of a lot of that sodium. It's not going to keep it. And so that's why the small equal amounts every 20 to 30 minutes in the amount that you lost is actually going to be retained better by your body than trying to do it as fast as possible. A lot of people do it as fast as possible because honestly trying to remember to drink every 30 minutes or so throughout an evening after workout is quite frankly annoying. And a lot of people have other things to do and they forget about it. But if you're going to be serious about maintaining hydration and fluid balance and electrolyte balance, it's something that you have to do. And looking into this, is chicken noodle broth just as good as the pasta and broth? I think it's a little bit differently just because the sodium, a lot of people add boiling water for pasta, isn't even close to the amount of sodium in chicken noodle soup. And I think it's more, pasta's more starchy based as opposed to the chicken noodle soup. One of the primary ingredients is a ton of salt. And I actually think one of the other chicken noodle soup studies that I didn't reference in this one actually just used straight up Campbell's chicken noodle soup. I think they even went to just Costco and just bought the big crates of it and fed it to people. And that's ideally what that is. But again, the important part about that study that we just talked about was not that it's just a chicken noodle soup. They ate and drank that, but they continued to drink water throughout the evening because water follows salt into the body and the body retains it better. One of the things these sodium drinks or these sodium replacement guidelines do with chicken noodle soup is your body actually urinates less if it's in closer to if you intake a lot of sodium, and so that free water loss that you're losing throughout the evening is actually decreased a little bit and helps with that fluid retention. Were there other questions I missed? Cool. Does anybody else have any questions that you're thinking of?
So we'll stay logged on for a couple more minutes just in case anybody does have any questions. But just as a reminder, you'll all get a copy of this presentation emailed to you, and then keep an eye out for a survey as well. We just want to know how your experience was and what we can do to kind of improve your experience moving forward. Also, we will be promoting some more programming online, so keep an eye out to, on emails that you get from us so that you can sign up for stuff in the future. And then obviously you see here on the question slide Mike's email address, so if you do run into anything you can email him after this. And then if you want to take a note, my email address is actually a.cole, not m.cole. Sorry for that mistake, but it's a.cole at nu.edu. And then we did have one more question, so I will let Mike answer this, and then we will wrap up.
So this is actually a good question and kind of, I think, takes it a little bit further. So just as an aside, if you have questions, feel free to email me. This is a lot of information that, depending on your level of scientific understanding with human physiology, I can go really deep down a rabbit hole from a science standpoint, but I'm always happy to answer questions and that sort of thing. But with Douglas's question about drinking chicken broth before a century will help with cramps and late bike miles. One of the two leading basically theories behind muscle cramping right now are it's electrolyte deficit, or there's a neurological fatigue component that I actually personally tend to think is has more weight behind it from a scientific standpoint. And the reason that is if someone cramps, the first thing you do is you stretch them. And so you're actually turning that cramp off by a neurological mechanism. From a scientific standpoint, we all know about sodium-potassium channels and nerve conduction, but to be honest with you, if potassium and sodium levels are that low, someone's not going to be riding a bike, they're not going to be playing a sport, they're probably going to be in a hospital because those levels, in order for that whole body cramping to occur, is pretty low. But when we're talking about chicken broth before a century, you can actually delay that fatigue that fatigue point where you start abandoning proper cycling mechanics by making sure your aerobic capacity is higher, and that's what we call the big long way of referring to it as sodium-facilitated hypervolemia, but essentially you can shorten that to sodium loading, which is pretty common in the elite endurance community. And what people do is usually no sooner than 90 minutes before a workout, people start, these elite athletes with some maybe nutritional coaches will start having high sodium beverages like chicken broth or maybe some other type of concoction, depending on who they're working with, that'll slowly artificially raise their plasma volume, which is supported by hydration, but you need the sodium to actually get the water to stay in your body. And then when they go and do their exercise, they tend to go to fatigue longer. There's some studies with sodium loading where all things considered equal in a time trial or an 80-kilometer race simulated on cycle ergometers, it's the same, and then they do a time trial to fatigue afterwards. And in some cases, the people that did the time trial on sodium loading finished a full kilometer faster, they went a kilometer further in the same amount of time than the people who didn't. And there's another study by Sims that used sodium loading that they ran people to fatigue, and the people that did sodium loading actually ran about 21 minutes farther than the people who didn't. So there's a considerable ergogenic aid if this is done properly. And again, in high-level athletes, like we said, even in our example, which I didn't even consider a high-level athlete, lost 3.5 grams of sodium practically, and that's well over what the FDA recommends. So I know people have how muscle cramping occurs. I still think there's no consensus on that, but I know a study just came out. I could pull it up if I think I remember exactly what journal it's in, but it's relatively available to a lot of people. That basically did a systematic analysis and review of all the available research on literature and found that there's actually no definitive link between sodium and potassium losses and muscle cramping. So basically, strategy should be focused on delaying fatigue, working on movement patterns, sometimes changing how you pedal and kick in those late miles has a big effect on how that works. And I think. And I hopefully that answers your question. If not, I can talk to you about that further if you want to email me as well. I'll be happy to answer questions. But I thank you guys for taking time out of the middle of your day or your lunch hours, depending on where you are, to kind of listen to this. Again, it's a pretty deep rabbit hole to go down with a lot of different angles. I can humor any questions if you have those in the future. And hopefully I'll do more of these on some different topics for the alumni office in the future. So, good. Thank you.